some of them run into 5 pages, so I'm not going to be able to 5 pages. I'll just kind of extract a little bit here and there. I hope you don't mind if I exclude something. Okay, first up, Professor Krishna Sen. I've known Krishna for a long time. She was one of those lecturers here at Murdoch who inspired me to enter academic life. So that was a good...
Oh God, I didn't know I did that much damage.
The damage is still ongoing, as you can tell. Professor Krishna Sen, I think many of you know her already. She's the Executive Dean of Arts at the University of Western Australia. She's also Professor of Indonesian Studies at the university, so she holds that chair at UWA. What else do you want me to say?
Nothing. That's enough. Move on.
And I've had the privilege of working with her on a book project as well, so that's it. She's very well published, in media studies, communication, Indonesian studies. It's a great delight to have you here, Krishna. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. And Baden. Got you somewhere here. Good number of pages too, isn't it? Now, Baden often hosts the Dr. Haruhisa Handa Chair of Human Rights Education. Sorry, I'm not good at that one. He's Professor of Cultural Studies and Human Rights at Curtin University. He directs the Center for Human Rights Education. I think you've been in Perth now for a little while.
1 year.
1 year.
It's a hot year.
Yeah, moved over from the East, from Southern Cross University, where he was for a good number of years. And he's helped Professor of Australian Studies at University of Tokyo a few years back, and look, he's very well regarded in the cultural studies space. I think some of us know him very well for that. Thank you for coming. Alec.
Move on.
The grand old man of...
Bugger off.
The grand old man of cultural studies.
And very polite.
May I introduce to you Professor Alec McHale. He's emeritus professor here at Murdoch. He's another one of those who taught me when I was young and relatively...
Taught all of us.
Taught all of us. Anyone who wasn't taught by Alec, raise your hand.
Now, he's kind of removed every reference to himself on the web. So the best I can find is this one.
That's not true.
If he appears
That's
on
the methodology.
That's not true. My home pages are still on the
They've removed
old
you from
MCC.
Really? No, he was up to 2007 the head of the School of Media, Communication and Culture. In fact, you were head of school even prior to that. When you
He was my boss.
Okay, he still teaches. He does supervision. He runs the honors program here at Murdoch, and it's a great delight to have him here because he's got plenty of nuggets of wisdom to share with us. Thank you. I think I'll stop there before I face a backlash.
It's a rowdy panel.
Next up is Debbie. Got you right here. Okay. Dr. Debbie Roden is Senior Lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies at ECU, Edith Cowan University. Debbie has published 2 international books, Identity and Justice, Conflicts, Contradictions and Contingencies. That's with Peter Lang. Disability, Obesity and Aging, Popular Media Identifications. And that's a co-authored book with Katie Ellis and Pierre Lepac. Pierre is from Murdoch, actually.
Yes.
And she's currently writing the 3rd international book on activism and digital culture in Australia. And I'm delighted that she's publishing in the series that I helm and oversee. That's with Roman and Littlefield. Right? And she's also published in many other journals, so you would have read many of her works already. And again, I'm delighted that she's here. She's one of our Waccm collaborators. And finally, last but not least, we've got my colleague, Catherine Trees. Now, she teaches in media communication here at Murdoch University, and she's particularly interested in units with socio-political and economic processes of globalization and the ways they intersect, the impact rather, with gender and cultural politics. She is an extraordinary supervisor. There are not many people who have seen PhD students through from start to finish, and for that reason, I've invited her to talk about supervision in the afternoon. Okay. In 2006, she worked on the West WA Law Reform Commission's Customary Law Report. And in 1994, she worked for the Australian Institute Judicial Association, organizing the first cultural awareness workshops for, just lost. She worked for the Australian Institute Judicial Association, organizing the first cultural awareness workshops for magistrates and judges. So she's kind of been working in the intersection of law, media, and communication. Again, I'm delighted that she's able to join us today. Okay, without further ado, this is what I'm going to get the panelists to do. Kind of speak to the notes that you've already prepared, and then we'll start a discussion and questions from the floor. So I'm intending to make this as conversational as possible. Yeah. So Krishna gets to go first.
Sure. So I'm a bit threatened by the thought that I'm sitting here as a kind of elderly person trying to project what the next generation of academics, because many of you are the next generation of academics, new PhDs, new academics, also some not so new academics, but those of you who will work for the next 10 to 20 years, what you are going to do well past the time that I retire. So what I'm going to do is not so much give you nuggets of wisdom, but to think about what are the trends. It's not that you don't know the trends, but in my position as the Dean of a faculty, I get to see those contradictions in your face all the time. So I'll just talk about some of those contradictions that are emerging that you're conscious of, and you can work out what on earth you should do in what will turn out to be a very interesting time. And I don't mean that interesting in maybe live in interesting times curse kind of way. I think it is a very interesting time. It is a time of rapid change, and this is all a bit cliched, change being the only constant, but it's not that far from the truth. It is a very fast changing situation, and we know, of course, that the pace of change is faster. The pace of political and social change is faster in the current time in our generation than it was a generation ago, and probably will be faster again in the next generation. So what are the contradictions that we face all the time at the institutional level and at the individual level? So first of all is the kind of tension between research and teaching. Everybody knows that your personal pathway through the system, your progression in your career, is research dependent. On the other hand, everybody knows the university depends on student numbers. We subsidize research by teaching. There is no question about this. Every statistic suggests that. What this means, of course, is there is a disciplinary split that is happening, because science research is more expensive and socially seen as more productive. And in some ways, it is true science research is more productive, I guess. I mean, I buy into that as well. But it's also more destructive. So it has more impact. If we think about impact, I think science research does have impact in an obvious way, in a way that we can't show. So the nanochemist can produce something that then is sold in a shampoo which sticks to your hair 1 second longer than the previous shampoo did. But when Dick Robison's book, Dick is a senior scholar of this university, and that's why I'm naming him. When Dick Robison's book is read by photocopies of the banned Dick Robison book is read on the streets of Jakarta by students as they are bringing down the Suharto government, we can't actually measure that impact. And as impact becomes more and more of a judgment on research, we have this problem of we being put, our discipline groups, not just cultural studies and media, but humanities and social sciences more broadly, I think, particularly humanities, getting pushed into that kind of research that has immeasurable impact, but it's literally immeasurable in a very concrete sense. So what happens is then science looks more important, science is more expensive, science research costs a lot of money. We teach, and the teaching funds are then moved across to research, and in that process there is a disciplinary shift of funding that happening everywhere, at my university, your university, at universities around the country. So that's one of the tensions with which we live. And you have to make a judgment around what you're going to do around this issue, both collectively and individually. The other thing is, we all know staff-student ratio is getting worse, and we all know we are being pushed to be more efficient. And in this process of being more efficient, there is a sense in which the technology might allow us to have better teaching, more engaged teaching, and quantitatively more teaching at some point, but that's going to need a lot of careful thinking through. So at the same time that we are having to think about being quote unquote more efficient, do more for less, you've got, and you know, in my role as Dean, I say it all the time. No, not here as Dean. So I'm hoping I'm in a safe space. But this thing about efficiency is a bit problematic, because we have no instruments for measuring what constitutes efficient teaching. The only measurements we have for measuring teaching is actually the popularity stakes, is actually what your students say about you. Now, we don't have neurological things implanted in the student's brain to say what went blip when Alex said fuck in the middle of a class. So, and you can't do those kinds of things in classes anymore.
No,
You realise
I don't.
that. I get a complaint from students if anyone does that. So anyway, so the measuring is, and on the one hand, we're being measured to the nth degree. On the other hand, the instruments are not doing what they need to do. So in this context, what's happening, I was talking to Michelle a few minutes earlier, and thinking about the extent to which those of us are managers, really, and I put Michelle and myself in that category. What we are seeing in that context is that there is an increasing split between teaching and research. Now, what we need to do, what I'm hoping to do, I think we have to do as a collective, is that not in that process of the split, not devalue teaching, that institutionally we find pathways through which you can progress in teaching and in research. And we have decisions to make, both as a collective and as individuals, as to what precisely we are going to do in this context. Okay. The second set of things I want to talk about is the problem with HAS research. If you see what is happening across, actually, no, sorry. I have to say one more thing about teaching. One of the positive things about teaching is the extent to which in country after country, we are looking at the political leadership recognizing the importance of teaching in art. You know, there was this whole discussion in the last decade about STEM, and in this decade it's all about STEAM. Somebody in America about 5 years ago cleverly put the arts into the middle of the STEM discipline, and since then Koreans have adopted this policy of high school teaching where you have to have arts, and it started as a kind of getting some kind of creative input into the curriculum of STEM, but what it has become is really a more of a legitimization of undergraduate arts education, from philosophy to languages to media studies. So it's become a much more inclusive A for arts, and some of the VCs in this country, including my own, yes, have started talking about STEAM quite a lot, sometimes looking at me at the end of the room saying, I have to say this because Krishna will kill me if I don't. But nonetheless, it is entering the discourse. And this might be something that we ride out, and we ride in a very aggressive way, and we say undergraduate teaching is incomplete unless we give them, alongside science or technology, some training in arts. And of course some universities have gone down that track, and I think it's proved to be not very financially productive, and so there may be a retreat from this. We need to defend it. You can tell where I'm coming from, so I won't say any more about that. But the STEAM is a very positive thing. It's a very positive thing about us and our role in teaching. In research, of course, we know that research funding for the arts as a whole and social sciences is under stress. Two things have happened. One is in many other parts of the world, we haven't had that yet, but arts funding has been seriously defunded at the university level. Japan last year, there was a big hullabaloo. I don't know how many of you saw anything about it. But basically, university teaching in arts was severely defunded towards the end of last year in Japan. But in our own case, in Australia, one of the things that's happening, which I don't know why we're not making more noise about it, but there is a report called the Ian Watt report, which is recommending that publications are no longer funded by block grants. If publications are no longer funded by block grants, of course the government says the universities can do what they want. I would just like to see a university 5 years down the track, if block grant publication is defunded, that is still, sitting there funding arts research. I'm sure I've taken up my 10 minutes. Do I have another two?
A couple minutes.
I'll do just 2 or 3 more things. I think I've said most of what I wanted to say. So in this context, I don't think if I retired tomorrow, I would recognize the university, if I came back to it, recognize the university as a university I knew if I come back 10 years later. Because of course one of the things I haven't said, but which you all know, is the much more global trend in long distance, real-time delivery of teaching. Monash is the only one which has developed this multi-screen room in Australia. But Harvard has this thing called CAVE. The guys who built it for Harvard came and showed it to us, and we thought we would have to sell the entire campus to pay for it, I think. But but the trend is there. So you can imagine that there would be a mode of teaching where in many ways what we think of as autonomous universities producing their own modes of thinking, schools of thought, might well be receding already, and that what happens in the media, something we know in media, what happened in the media in the last generation when big television, big media was gathering pace against national, individual, local kind of a delivery of media content. That could well happen in the university space, where teaching becomes a retail activity, research becomes much more limited, much more exclusive. Now, of course, we know in the media, because we are in cultural media studies, we know that there are counter trends in that same space. We know what goes on in the kind of social media space, and you can reimagine both teaching and research as an activity that is much more domestic, much more cottage industry, much less institutionalized, much more like the real first university of the world, Nalanda, which was established sometime before the birth of Christ in Eastern India, which was very small scale, but where Fa Hien walked from China across the Himalayas to study Buddhism. So that cottage industry doesn't mean it will not be international. There are models in the past that we can look to. I'm going to stop. I've gone way off where I wanted to talk about.
Thank you.
Me?
Are we doing the order of the?
I think we're doing that order.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, this one. Sorry.
Terence asked us for titles and that sort of stuff, and I thought we'd just have a conversation. So this is going to be like a conversation that only one person gets to speak, and you have to imagine what the other. I'm really glad that Krishna told us that the sciences are more productive than what we do. You know, thank God they found those gravitational waves the other day, because you know, I personally can't live without them. You know?
And the Big Bang today.
Yeah, I mean, shit. You know, this is, and people do. You know, it's the hairdresser's question, isn't it? You know, I hate the hairdressers. Like, what do you do? You know, and actually I usually say I work in an obscure branch of psychology that has to do with reading, and they say, oh, that's good, you probably help people with, you know, their dyslexia and stuff. Oh, if I tell them the truth, they say, well, what's the use of that? And the answer to that is, well, what use is a newborn baby? Yeah? They're absolutely bloody useless. But like, we can't survive to some extent, I think, without them. So, you know, I've got these kind of very positive things to say about the disciplines that I work in, and there's quite a lot of them. So Terence asked us for a title, and my title, because we're dealing with the future academic, my title is The Past Academic, that's me. The Past Academic versus Robo-Jaffa. Jaffa, spelled J-A-F-A, stands for just another academic. You can work out for yourself what the F stands for. And that's kind of what I think is kind of putting the brakes on the kind of thing that I would want to do if I were kicking off my career again, is a robotisation of academic life at all kinds of levels. At the level of research, this continual kind of question, well, what use is it? What, you know, how productive is this? I'd spent quite a lot. There was another recession in academic life during the Fraser government called the Lynch recession, which I don't know if some people here wouldn't even have been alive, but there were no jobs. So, you know, I had to do the worst possible thing that you can for your academic reputation, which was to go and work in a school of education. It's an absolute disaster. And people were worried that I was publishing papers in, you know, my particular peculiar branch of, well, sociology or cultural studies, or, you know, the hard end of cultural studies. And so I had to write this paper, which was a response to Terry Eagleton. Some of you may have heard of him. He's sort of Marxish. And
He's younger than Marx.
and yeah, and so I called it History Lessons, so that the people in the School of Education was thinking, oh, you know, that I was writing about history lessons, and it wasn't. It was just a lesson in history to Terry Eagleton, but it was a good title. So it was that kind of cheating. I had a cheating kind of feeling, because when I left that place, I did some stuff on philosophy of education, and when I said Plato, they thought they meant the squidgy stuff that primary kids, you know, it was that kind of intellectual kind of atmosphere that I want to kind of try to head off. And we don't have to be. I don't think we have to be useful in that sense. You know, the stuff that I produce is probably more effective in terms of what it does in fact, I wrote a book called Effective Semiotics, you know, about effectivity, which is kind of the opposite of efficiency. You hear university administrators talking about effectivity, and efficiency as if they're the same thing, but they're not. You know, quite often going the long way about something is the most effective. And so we end up in a kind of situation that Krishna's already sketched, whereby the rules inside an institution, okay, what you have to do day to day, and the rules outside the institution are going further and further apart. You know, that kind of history lessons example is just a really silly one, but they're growing further and further apart. I mean, in order to be successful, as it were, in your discipline and hopefully internationally, you're going to have to do things that kind of contradict the rules inside the institution, and I'd see that gap ever increasing. And part of the problem is that what's happening inside institutions is this incredible valuation of monetary capital. That's you know, Krishna's said it in a very nice way. I could say it in a much...
Oh, she's right in the midst of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been in the midst of it, you know. And what monetary capital means to employees, you know, as in, well, Jaffers, is it means you're there because you have to be there. And what's undervalued is, of course, cultural capital, which is something that many people in this room know about and have explored. And when you're in an institution which values cultural capital, you're there because you want to be there. You know, you like the place. You know, you feel part of the place, as opposed to the thing that just sticks money in your bank account every other Thursday. Okay, so the part of our question is, how do we make an argument for the increasing of cultural capital, the valuing of cultural capital over monetary capital? How do we do that? Well, one thing that I can say that will certainly do your career good, because we talked about teaching and research, we haven't talked about admin, and you probably notice if you're working in universities now that your admin load has gone up, even if it's just the administration of the units or courses that you teach. They're now demanding more and more and more and more admin. And so I was, instead of doing the seminar thing, the workshop or a masterclass, or in Kathy's case, a mistress class, I suppose. Do we have mistress classes? No, anyway, sorry, that's terrible, isn't it? I would like to give one, a masterclass on the art of administration avoidance. I mean, I wasn't very good at it myself. This would be like learning by my failures. You know, I didn't duck out of things that I could have, and I won't go into the personal reasons why, but that's something that I really would like to discuss as a practical matter. Is like, how do you at least minimise the bloody stuff? You know? Just two more things. Because, as Krishna said, you know, your career depends on research and etc., etc. Not just the amount of it, but the quality of it. And one of the pressures now, because of the difference between the rules inside and the rules outside the institution, is that it's very, very easy to lose any kind of reputation. Now, the pressure might be to quantity over quality. And it becomes very, very, very easy to do that. I wrote to a very good friend of mine who's a retired professor in New York, who, and it's important that you should know that he's Jewish. And I said, what can I tell people about reputation? And he said, first of all, he said, well, it's like virginity, you can only lose it once, you know. And then he told me this story about a guy who, a little Jewish boy, grows up in a backwoods kind of a town, but he's really good at school, gets scholarships, goes to New York, becomes a famous surgeon, and he's invited back to his hometown, because he's the most famous person this little town has ever produced. And he gets up in the town hall, and there's all the dignitaries, and most of the town are there. And he's got a lectern with his notes on. Anyway, a gust of wind comes through and blows the papers onto the ground, and he bends down to pick them up. And the microphone boom, just like this, only old and insecure, falls down and points at his backside, and he lets out absolute ripper fart. And the whole, you can see the walls shaking. No, and so he's so embarrassed. His name's Finkelstein, by the way. And he picks up his notes and he rushes out and he says to himself, I'm never going back. I can never go back there again. And some 20 years later, his mother gets sick and he has to go home because, he's a nice Jewish boy who wants to look after his mother. This is important. And so he goes and he in the dead of night, he books himself into the only hotel in town under the name of Cohen. And there's this young boy behind the very, very young boy behind the counter, and he says, Dr. Cohen, it's very nice to have you back. Have you been to our town before? And he says, oh yes, it was a long time ago. He said, what were you here for? He said, I did something I'm rather embarrassed about. And the boy says, well, people will forgive you. It's a nice country town. People are very forgiving. Of course, the country town is a small university in the parable. He says, people will forgive you. It's for how many years ago was it? He says, it was a long, long time ago. He says, and the boy, who would have been far too young, says, would that be before or after the Finkelstein fart? Here endeth the second. Here endeth the second lesson on the question of reputation. Now, Alex, final handy hint. Have another discipline, whatever you do. If you happen to do cultural studies or whatever, have another discipline as a hobby. Okay, like where there's nothing whatsoever at stake. It's something, maybe astronomy or something you enjoy. That's my attitude to philosophy. Is there shouldn't be card-carrying philosophers. It's a hobby. It's something you should have a philosophy shed. Where you kind of go down and you play with your philosophy equipment and so forth, and occasionally ransack the concepts for other purposes. That's Alex's final handy hint: is go and find another discipline and have it as a hobby. I don't know why I'm suggesting this. It's just
really
that
important suggestion. I know why you're suggesting it.
Why am I suggesting it, Krishna? This is the conversation bit.
Yeah. It's really important to have another hobby. If you are training to be a top-ranked sports person in any sort of sport, your trainer will tell you you must have another sport as your hobby, because you're training just one part of your body. Your discipline is training one part of your mind. You need a hobby to train the rest of it somewhat adequately.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, we keep telling students they should have breadth units, but do we have that ourselves? Very rarely, Yeah, if you've got time for a hobby,
Reading the loop.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Terry.
I'll say hold your questions. We'll talk a lot more afterwards. I'll let Baden start that. Yeah.
So first of all, I want to thank Glenn for that welcome to country, particularly in his 40th year as well. So, and I'm just thinking, as Alec was talking about that example of Finkelstein, of course, you may have seen the academic who was on Breakfast ABC TV the other day who froze and was unable to speak on national television about I think it was the Syrian, North Korean issue. And he's now writing on his blog about that experience. And yeah, you appreciate it. I'm sure. I mean, a room with media studies people. I'm sure you're over it, across it. And I guess, in a sense, I think it's a really good point. I mean, what Krishna and Alec have kind of presented, for me, as I reflect upon this question about what's the future academic like, is that there is this definitely very significant overview which we need to be very conscious and aware of, which is that we are in a very highly managerialized, scientized, capital driven environment, and universities in many ways we could say, following Ashish Nandi, is basically the most instrumentalized of places in terms of knowledge production, because we do admin so well. It's where it's perfected. It's where we're actually the guinea pigs of bringing out every kind of technology in relation to how we do knowledge, how we actually produce what we do. And so I think that awareness of the environment is really, really crucial. Now, I began my kind of career in a regional university on the East Coast as a passionate cultural studies, social justice oriented kind of person. And I think the future academic has always, for me, been something I've always had to be conscious of, in fact, that the future is always here. In universities, there is a quickening pace in relation to the way in which we now have to engage with it in relation to the corporate framework. But, when I look back to 1999, 2000, it was at this time when the internet was just sort of exploding into universities. I was part of a university which had a very quick uptake in terms of distance education delivery. So as a regional place, we had to think about these things. From 1999, I was using Blackboard pretty much just after I finished my PhD, which is now so common for most teaching. And I say that because, in a sense, over the course of my career so far, I've come to see that one of the hallmarks of being an academic is all around pace, and it's about negotiation, and it's about that negotiation through things like Alec talked about in relation to the hidden history lessons, the history lessons in the education faculty, for example, at school or whatever. Or it's the negotiation of teaching in the new modes that are upon us, in a sense, which, as I said before, I think we and universities are very much guinea pigs for in relation to this. But I want to kind of just regroup my thoughts, because I sort of, when Terence asked me to speak about this, I had a very positive list of how you might, get through this future academic moment or thought. And when I was contemplating this, for me, the image for me is that one needs to be a good surfer. And what I mean by surfing, in a sense, and using that metaphor, is that it is the fact that, as early career academics, as postgraduate students, as those of us who are mid-year to senior scholars know, I think it's pretty much shared amongst us all now in these conversations, is that we do have to engage with the extraordinary administration that we face all the time in our jobs, in our teaching. We have to excel in research, as Krishna so sort of soberly put, in a sense. That's where the actual gravity lies, in a sense, in relation to being an exceptionally, good academic. And of course, then you have teaching, which for me is very much the engine house of what a university is. And in fact, if you pare it away, what is the really basic relationship in a university? It's between a student and a teacher. I mean, in a sense, going back to that Nalanda example, this idea of what we do, what we ask, how we think, what knowledge we take up, what problems we think about resolving come from that relationship. So for me, when I start to think about what it means to be a good surfer as an academic, and I think obviously I'm saying this with the caveats that academia is changing, but as I say, it's been changing for a while. I mean, as Alec points out, I mean, the last 30 years, academia has been going through a tidal wave continuously. And of course, technology is really very much a part of that particular equation. And consequently, the notions of STEAM and everything are very, very important. Having a very good example of that is Graham Turner, who you may know, past president of the Academy of the Humanities and very much a cultural studies elder, you could say now. I don't know whether he'd like that. When I pass him by in Byron Bay, when he goes, on his morning walk, he doesn't really like that kind of thought that he might be
Just
like.
remind him that he used to be a folk singer.
Yes, he was exactly. But it's always interesting because he said this amazing story, always about the fact that when he was part of the Prime Minister's, I think he still is, science committee, and he would often say, he'd be in that particular room with, all these scientists around the table, and of course, whenever the conversation would revolve around a particular problem, and he would put forward something that would come from the humanities or social sciences or the arts, they'd say, but can you cure cancer? So this question, of course, is salient to what Krishna is talking about in terms of our validity, our space, and what Alec's talking about in terms of, where do we live? Now, so these are my kind of thoughts, in relation to what it means to think about the future academic. And when I look at this notion of what it means, I think for me that future academic is basically happening right now. We're dealing with it. You're here. You're a part of this particular journey. And I think there are different ways of thinking about how to surf this particular environment, particularly if you've got passion for that kind of cultural encounter and cultural knowledge, particularly if we have passion in the arts, humanities and social sciences for basically questions of social justice and things like that, which obviously I care about. And it's no coincidence that in my career, for example, I kind of, in a sense, negotiated where I was in the academy through the things I was passionate about, which led to, in a sense, coming to a marriage between cultural studies and human rights. But in terms of surfing, I just wanted to give you some, and these are not, I don't know if these are kind of tips, Alec. And I'm not sure that they would be great tips for sort of stopping that kind of Finkelstein story, but there are things that I think that are really sort of salient. So I'm just going to give you some what I think are practical ideas about how to surf this environment in ways that you might be able to have something which is meaningful as well as exceptional. I think in some ways, as many academics would say, in this sense that there's a game to be played. We are in a sense in a field where you are playing a game. Administration is just a very sophisticated gaming system that creates all of these barriers between the student and the teacher again, which I'm sure in terms of higher degrees is, we're all very familiar with in terms of PhDs as well. But I think that there are certain things that are at the heart of surfing well. And I think these things, in a sense, are pretty much a part of what we try to do in creating these spaces for cultural research, for media research, for humanities research in these institutions, in these places that we work. And again, it comes back to a kind of speaking back to Krishna's tensions, that of course I'm interested in the organics. I mean, if I'm interested in the relationship between the teacher and the student, or that dynamic, then I'm interested in the organic production of knowledge. And I'm not going to unpack that. You all know in some ways what I might be talking about. But the idea of what we are as intellectuals. So what does it mean to be a good surfer? I think it means to be agile. I think one of the most important facets of embarking on a career now, or being an early career researcher, is to think about that agility. You might get the agility, in fact, from having a hobby. I think agility comes from being obviously interdisciplinary, being open to opportunities, possibilities, to, in a sense, what I think is the whole heart of a university life, which is encounter. the ability to actually form networks, to build relationships, to actually have build that kind of development between yourself and your colleagues, between yourself and your students. That mutuality, which absolutely, in a sense, creates a kind of a thing which I call an agile surfing through the academic life. And I think this is demonstrated in lots of ways. And I'm just going to give you a couple because I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but we can talk about it afterwards in the questions and answers, perhaps. But one of the things, and for example, in terms of that kind of the kind of survival mechanisms that we now have in relation to being a future academic, is that we need to be, and this is again speaking back to Alec and Krishna, we have to curate our academic life. We actually have to be, this is the age of curation. Who can better do it than a cultural research or a media studies or a humanities person, but to curate it? And what might that mean, to curate our online presence, our delivery on television, or how we respond to those failures that we have? Because failure is also a very good and important thing, in fact, in relation to this kind of question. But for me, that agility comes, that good oil for being a future academic comes from the ability to understand what it might mean to network. Because I think networking is something that is a very understated activity in what we do. In fact, it's built upon the relationships we have in co-locations, along the corridor, in conversations like this, where we meet for the first time or over and over. We are building a scholarship, a community of scholarship, a community of fellow academics, which I think comes through acts of generosity, acts of friendship. I was at a cultural studies conference last year in Kobe, the Asian Conference in Cultural Studies, and John Ernie from Hong Kong, who's a very well-known cultural studies and human rights scholar in Hong Kong, who did the Crossroads Conference in 2010. He said, one of the things that really has got him through, which he sees and thinks is really one of the most critical factors in building an academic life, is actually friendship. And I think that's a really interesting point, because it's in contradistinction to the corporate life that we lead. I have a friend who's a Dean of Arts at a university on the east coast of America, who said, I asked him last year, do you have lots of friends at the university? He said, no, I have no friends. I've been there for 5 years, but because I'm the dean, sorry.
Do I have any friends?
I think you do.
But you get my point. There's a tension around this kind of interesting life we have as academics, because on the one hand we're here, we are engaged with that tradition which comes from the very university that Krishna talked about, and the very sort of tactile nature of the encounter that we have in a university between student and teacher. And yet, in some ways, what really sustains us through it all, what gets us there, through all of the complexity of the administration, which is like a tidal wave, through the expectations of the metric system. There's a vice chancellor, I'm not going to mention his name, but he has a colour-coded chart and looks at each of his researchers every year to see on that colour code whether you're blue, red, green, or whatever. Which of course you don't do that, do you? Anyway, but you know what I mean. But this is the kind of metricisation of what we do as well. How do we speak back to that? I think, this is my humble view, is that we speak back to that through how we basically are agile, we surf through this, we find friendships, we have that kind of collegiality which comes through that kind of organic, ongoing connection with others. And this is just something that I've seen over and over again. And I'll give you, and there's two examples about how I think networking, particularly for those of you in this room, that is important. One of my colleagues in the Centre for Human Rights Education, she's an early to mid-year career academic, noticed through the list, the email lists we get around all the time, so this is very important what Rob and Michelle talk about, noticed that there was an ARC laureate mentoring scheme for women that was being done by Joy Demussy in Melbourne University. And this was an opportunity for her to spend 5 days to be mentored in a place, in a group with a group of other women, young female academics, for a whole week, paid by the ARC in that particular project. And that is one of those moments, I think, which, in an instrumental sense, we look for leverage in relation to building that particular career for the future, for now. And I think those sorts of things are really, really significantly important. But again, I think what gets you through, in fact, is collegiality and friendship, because this instrumentality is not going to go away, and it's going to become more and more complex. And I think that Krishna and Alec have painted that particular landscape very well.
Yours? Yep. I'll just click it for you as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Thanks. Okay, thanks very much, Terence. So I'm just going to share some collective experiences and some of my own experiences, and some of them you might agree with or disagree with, but it actually follows, I think, quite well from what Baden has said. Because I actually didn't even begin to understand academic life until I was 8 years into the job. And what actually happened for me was that I was invited by the Associate Dean to attend a course for a week at Women in Research Leadership. And it was at the University of Queensland Business School in Brisbane, and that was in 2010. So there were 40 participants from various disciplines, including the sciences, and 20 Australian universities. And I got to speak to quite a lot of people. We were in a very small room, so we actually did get to know each other very well. So from this professional development, I wanted to share with you a number of the take-home messages which are still relevant to me. And I'll just sort of go through those. One of the first things I really began to realise was to plan the career you want, to look at where you want to go next after your PhD. I mean, I had sort of been doing that and muddling along and working with the mentors that we had, with the professors, which were great, and that was sort of happening. And also, I think in the 4 of our Waccm seminars, panel presenters have shared their ideas on career planning, which have been very valuable. But you might want to consider what might be a good way forward for you. The other thing was that the PhD is the base for the entry into the university, and I certainly would think that is definitely the case for the future academic. What counts is what you do after that. After publishing my PhD into a book, I found working towards developing a new research project was the best way forward. It was very messy. It took some time. I probably think really started to do that about 6 or 7 years ago. Networking is very important. I think talk to people at events like this and speaking up at conferences, taking opportunities to be part of panels and conferences elsewhere. Even if the conferences, we're looking for people to be the timekeeper. We're looking for people to just be the MC. Put your hand up, no matter how much you fear public speaking, have a go, because it's really quite good preparation. Now, self-promotion is very important in order to get known. So for some people, this is going to be very hard if you have been a background in not promoting yourself. But it can all be done with finesse. You can join Academic EDU, you can join ResearchGate, join LinkedIn. Have your own webpage. Start recording your activities so that you can build an academic profile. I think this is very useful for selection criteria for biographies, for promotions, and it really takes some time to do. Be strategic. Know what's worth doing and not what's not. Now, my understanding of this has changed over time, and this is of course important in relation to administrative activities. I was the director of the Createch Research Centre for about 3 years, and that was a great job because I learnt a lot, I built confidence, and I understood even more about academic life. And it was actually what led me to become part of Waccm, because I actually did have that role. So it's worth taking up some roles. Continue studying, doing courses to gain skills, learn how to negotiate. This was a tip given to me by one of the scientists at the Women in Research Leadership. Learn how to supervise and keep up with technologies. Now the next one I'm still working on, but I thought it was a fantastic idea, which is have an elevator pitch. 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 2 minutes and 5 minutes. Now I actually found this takes some time to develop. It's a valuable skill, especially if you're going to talk about your research in the media, and if anyone asks you about what you're working on right now. So one of the things you could also do is consider writing for the conversation. It's about 800 words an article, but they do help you edit it. But these processes are actually fairly time consuming, so you might want to sort of make sure it works for you. Do not spend too much time making things perfect. Okay, when you're doing your journal papers, that might be the time to do it. So work on the publication as much as you can. So you put something in that's really easy to read as well. But for other documentation, I found it might be just worth making sure it's clear what you're saying and then move on. Manage upwards. Be proactive with your managers. Question what's required so you're clear about the expected outcomes. And of course, I would always be up to date with the university policies, because then you absolutely know what direction the university is going in. And the final point is seek multiple mentors. This enables you to weigh up the best approach for you. Some advice might conflict with the previous person's advice and point of view. Some advice simply might not be right for you. Choose what's best. Okay, so what I understand now in 2016, I'm not operating in a vacuum. And during the summer this year, I read Ruth Bakan's book. Ruth is a cultural studies scholar at the University of Sydney. Academic Life and Labour in the New University, Hope and Other Choices. And I took away 3 aspects about the new university. Bureaucracy, which is morphed into the audit culture. People have said this in many different ways at the table here. The other part is the vocational, which is the connection between the personal passions, endowments and work. And that academic life is a way of life, not just a job. You'll need to have boundaries though, so your passion is not eaten up. And the third point was about corporate culture that aspires to excellence. So things like reading and thinking are seen as unproductive time. But the problem is you're not producing a product, which links to the point that Alec made. You know, there's some of the best work, and you can see that when you read scholarly books. You can see some of the best work has taken 5-10 years to really come together. Okay, there are many external as well as internal pressures which impact the university, but if personally and as an individual academic, you need to know who to say no to, why you say no, and how you say no, which really does matter. So my last slide is get into the pool and start swimming.
Thanks, Debbie, that's good advice. Now everyone, I'm just going to touch on a couple of points so that there is at least a moment for some quick discussions. Like Krishna, I want to say, I'm towards the end of my career, and you are facing quite a different environment in which you are going to work. One of the things that for me has been really important is that I do come from an interdisciplinary background. It is a mixture of literature, cultural studies, law, and I have chosen to work in that way for my academic career. It means that I have not taken one trajectory, and that might have meant if I was taking one trajectory, I would have done a lot more in that path. So that is a really important decision, and to think about what are the consequences of that. But, and for me, I suppose it came to what Alec was saying about having other passions, other interests in life. Well, I was very, very fortunate as an undergraduate student to study with someone who demanded a really high quality from all students, and who made us very much aware that how we represented our own self-respect was about our work. And that was Professor Vijay Mishra. He had his expectations of students were high, and he did not feel as if he had to do everything in the universe with you. What he had to do with you was clear, and it gave you skills and so on to go elsewhere. So that way of pacing oneself, and therefore being able to respect oneself as an academic, as a student. And so that sometime when I find myself getting flustered by the administration, by the many ways that I get torn, just try to bring myself back and say, okay, what is it that I'm doing now, and what is it that I want, am wanting for the students, needing to do for the students, as well as for my own research. And so I'd just like to say a couple of things particularly about teaching, and that is that while we have all the pressure on us to research, and not just pressure from the academy, but also from ourselves, from our own interests, we are, as Baden says, teachers. It is absolutely important that we respect that teaching space, and remember that students come to the university with expectations, with ideals, with some of them come with wanting a way forward to jobs, others come with wanting a way forward to jobs and wanting to do creative work and wanting to have other social aspects to their lives, and that we don't want to be cynical, because otherwise we rob them of this really important moment. So getting our balance is exceedingly important. It's really important that we remember that we are part of the mix of changing students' lives, changing our colleagues' lives, and being changed by those. And I know that can sound really glib, we change someone's life, but the truth is, we do have students at the end of a degree who will come back, or at the end of a semester, and say, I hadn't thought about that, or that's where I want to go. Well, that's really important. And so I think in that way, we therefore have impacts on the society in which we live, and we're giving other people ways of having impacts on the society in which we live. And likewise for ourselves, we're then getting things from our colleagues, but also from the students. We need to often stop and think, how much did I learn from that student's PhD? How much did I learn from that student's comment in class about their cultural background? And I think that trying to keep a hold of that can really help in an era where we're absolutely under the pump, as we all know, in many other ways. Now, there's much more I could say, but I'm going to stop because we don't have otherwise a moment for you to discuss.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow, that was right. I don't know how to make this conversational, but if people have any points they want to raise, other than just questions or things to add on, do so now. Yeah, Glenn?
I'll start with a statement and then I'll ask the question. Murdoch University is in a current transition, as with all universities are, particularly from a marketing point of view, advertising on bus stops and back of hobos. And what I've noticed with our advertising is never ever about arts. And I brought this question up to the VC, acting VC, and to marketing, and asked them why. And they have all of the Orwellian spin about why arts isn't part of that paradigm. It's also happening at UWA. There's obviously colleges being implemented, and I noticed there was not any word to do with arts. So we're under attack. So probably Krishna, how do we fight back? How do we, when we've got people like the acting VC and people in our university institution sort of neglecting to include us in any of this marketing and certainly in the way the university runs? How do we fight that?
So, I mean, there is a very serious issue around advertising, and I get it, but I've also seen the figures for Murdoch and other universities in this town, the latest TISC figures, and Murdoch is doing exceptionally well, thank you very much. Better, you've had more growth this year than any other university in town. So something's gone right for
Back
you.
of hobos is working, which is good.
So something's gone right for you. Don't sneeze. On the UWA side of things, I was sure somebody was going to ask me this question. I am absolutely convinced that we will not end up with a college title which does not have either arts or humanities or something in it, because it doesn't make sense from the point of view of the liberal arts model of undergraduate teaching that the university committed to and entered into in 2012. And as a result of which, the review of that of the new courses done by colleagues from other universities, Melbourne, and I can't remember what the other universities were. One of the things they commended, one of the 6 things they commended UWA was, and I quote, unprecedented and nationally recognized growth in languages. So we've grown languages at a time when everybody else has shrunk. We've added Korean at a time when people have closed. We are about to add Spanish. So it has been in some ways a very successful journey. But am I constantly fighting the drift of research funding to science? Absolutely, every day. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a battle, but it's got to do more with the this kind of where numbers are. This thing about you were talking about this. Everybody has spoken about it. Where numbers and measures of impact are so important, and it's coming from the Prime Minister. This is not coming from individual Vice Chancellors. So I don't know. The symbolic parts of it, I'm sure we're going to. I shouldn't say this so early in the restructure process, but I don't think we'll end up.
Can I say something to Glenn, just briefly? Where I've seen arts directly advertised in other universities, and not in this state, the advertising's been woeful. And one of the problems is that Central University admin never calls on its own talent. Yeah. We got people here who are kind of world renowned in PR. Do they call on them? Nah. One of the campaigns, by the way, involved just one word in 2 colours, and it was smarts. But of course the SM was in another colour. and it had rather unfortunate connotations. SM arts. There's an example of bad advertising.
Very bad. I was just going very quick example of good advertising, Glenn, is actually University of Western Sydney, which I don't know if any of you saw. That was the one for one of their ex-students who
they won an award. Everybody
won an award.
saw
Yeah,
it.
you've all seen it, and that is in fact the kind of thing that is what we need to see more of. And that's very true. The very students, in fact, the very people in our own place are actually there. And it's funny how institutions always look elsewhere first, which is it's bad.
Waste money that we could have.
That's right.
Yeah.
Any other points?
I really enjoyed your presentations. Thank you very much. Coming from another point of view, I taught in education for a long time in the system of education is the first level there. And found myself by default doing a PhD, not in education but in creative arts. And so I taught music for a long time and enjoyed all of that, and moved across into this field. So I'm going to graduate on next Monday night, but I want to know why, at the end of this graduation and this PhD, why then, because I'm interested in my music and literature research, but not employed by the university as such. So I'm wondering why, when you graduate from a university, you lose all your rights to the library to do your future research from alumni at an undergraduate level. And I think that, I can't borrow a bonus book. I can't do anything except, have a book for a couple of weeks and then, send it back. And so the government put a lot of money in me because I got a scholarship to do this. And then the university then is repaid in the sense that I finished, my PhD. So I'm wondering from a student, and I think students pay a lot of money to come to the university. A lot of my friends had to take loans out and all that. So when you say teaching, I have nothing but the highest regard for teaching and research. Of course, they go hand in hand because that's where I'm interested now, I suppose. But I think it's really an onus on the universities to recognise the 5 years of study into something that where you go across around the world and meet all these people, as you've been saying, and develop networks with people from the University of Liège in Belgium or in Romania at Lucy Malaga, and you develop this network and you're still in contact with these academics, and yet at the end of the 5 years of your supervision of PhD, you're just then the strings cut. And I think that there's an onus on each university anywhere in the world to recognise that this body of people have just been let go. And I wonder what you're going to do about it.
It's certainly a real problem here at Murdoch. It's one I absolutely acknowledge. We have a real issue so people who have finished their PhDs, they're here doing contract teaching and so on. Tutoring. They are having to get temporary contracts each semester. And that part is one thing, but it's that the library cuts off in between, etc. As you say, there's alumni, yes, please.
As someone, I actually work in alumni relations here at Murdoch. And you
perfect.
So you need to go to the you become an alumnus as of your conferment next week.
Yes.
And then you go to the library and they will issue you with a card as alumni. That means that you still have access to the library.
I'm not denying that, but I'm just saying to you that you can't borrow bonus books.
It's not actually alumni relations, it's the library that makes those decisions. So as someone who works in who's a PhD student.
I have an alumni, card.
No, so we're pinned down as well.
Okay.
Well,
thanks.
Sorry about that.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that separately because it's quite aside from
point.
some of the issues that we're looking at. But
I think there's a broader issue.
Yeah.
I'm Jackson, I'm a PhD in writing at ECU. I must say, a little bit disappointed in some ways in my university experience so far after a year. The supervision has been wonderful, but if I had to pick one word to describe my relationship with the institution, I'd choose client. Feels like I'm there to get something and then whatever after that. And I think what this lady's talking about is an example of one of the sort of symptoms of that broader problem. You don't feel like you're being brought into a collegial environment.
Yeah, we once had a more or less senior administrator who started off his pep talk to the staff, the academic staff, by saying, and I quote, "We are all salesmen." I think that captures it rather nicely.
I think there is a real issue around this. So the university language actually openly now talks about students as clients, and what you're feeling is
it's
actually
across the board. of
It's
course.
actually it's
I
across the board.
I come from the arts and culture
Yeah.
professional world,
Yeah.
and we have client relationships.
Yeah.
Um,
So
And I think, but I think, Jackson, it's very interesting. I think that, universities are big places, and I think it's very context dependent about where those relationships are built up. That's one thing. But I think there's a systemic issue there, and an angst. There's an angst amongst all people, I think, in the arts, humanities, and social sciences about that relationship
Science
between.
too.
And science too, absolutely. And so I think, but in some ways though, it's our job to, I think,
So
to question this a bit more.
What
yeah.
we don't have, that scientists have, is that you belong to a lab, and when you belong to the
Exactly.
lab,
There's a-
you are part of that scholarly community. I think this is a really important question,
Mm.
and we really need to maintain scholarly community to which you belong, no matter what the institution does. And I think this is a scholarly community.
Mm.
That's
And
right.
these
Yeah, I feel
guys
very
are doing a
comfortable
great
here.
job.
Yeah.
So congratulations to those who are doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, it's interesting. That's precisely why Michelle and I first started this conversation to pull together this Waccm group together. And I think we do want to help this continue one way or another, which is why the next session after this is significantly important. So please don't run away
That's
after
a good
this.
place to finish.
We'll probably just have one comment. If you,
Can I just ask while we've got the panel, where are we at with teaching, communicating through Australian history? Because I think as a university, we're sending out these people that are ill-equipped to deal with problems. And, and we talked about effectiveness, and that's something, and I'm sure you guys actually applied in administration in this, but when I was working at ECU quite a while ago, they were saying that, Justice, Health, all these major sort of disciplines where we're having, the Indigenous problem, but we're having refugee problems now because it's starting to move across, it's becoming more international. But I was wondering if you could tell us where are we at with actually that communication of true Australian history, because they can talk about Aboriginal history, but it's not. It's actually Australian history that has Aboriginal content. It's Australian history with refugee content. It's and I was just wondering if you could sort of tell us where we're at.
Can I?
perhaps we could extend that to beyond just Australian history, but just broad engagement with with issues in our community and beyond. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think just again, one of the things that we can provide students and our colleagues with is the ability to have critical talks, to engage critically, not to accept anything. If we're reading a book, we don't accept, or we hope we don't accept one view of it. And I think that is it, starting to learn more about ourselves, learning more about how that engages with a whole range of broader knowledges, and therefore analysing situations, having discussions with things, so that we would hope that someone coming out of university might not so readily just take the rhetoric, for instance, that perhaps a politician or a particular ideologue or whatever.
I suppose I was looking at it more from a university as a whole, because you may not come in contact with business students unless they have to do a core unit within that field. That's probably where I was coming. That's where I'm at from Curtin.
Somebody said it.
No, I agree with Kathy. I think it's very important that we, as part of being teachers, we teach critical thinking. We must actually question the particular rhetoric that comes out of universities, out of politicians, out of any kind of organisation. We must not accept that as as the truth.
Yeah.
It's just another discourse, and how we're going to actually deal with that is where we need to develop some strategies.
It's true. Just as a minor comment, it's interesting you say that. It's a really big subject that I've got a lot of interest in. Toni Morrison, the American author, the Nobel laureate, once said that racism is a scholarly affair. And I always come back to that statement and how universities, what they are supposed to be doing, in a sense, is challenging those sorts of things. But where is racism produced, in fact? Where is Whereas heteronormativity, can I use that word at the moment, given the national discussion on the LGBT safety thing? You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, a big point, and I don't myself. I think we are driven in a sense by agendas. I mean, I'm just speaking very quickly here, but political agendas that come through from the Prime Minister, as Christian said. There's a whole thing there, and what we do in universities, in some ways, I think, is very fraught. But that idea that racism is a scholarly affair is something to be thinking about.
Yeah. I've just realised that somebody who we all probably know, at least by name, has snuck into the back of the room somewhere. Vijay Mishra came in.
Yes, he was there.
And I can't believe we're having this discussion with Vijay in the room, and we haven't asked Vijay how things have changed in his.
I wanted to when Catherine mentioned it.
In his lifetime.
Is this in light of the comments about missing histories? Just general historical knowledge seems to have disappeared. I mean, I was in an honours seminar last year, and I happened to mention the Vietnam War, and somebody said, "Was there a war in Vietnam?"
I just came back from Vietnam, and they said, "I just came back. I didn't realise there was a war."
Terence, I know we have to wrap up, but just to come back also to Jackson's point, which I think is a really important point for both as a PhD student, as colleagues, etc., is our sense of academic community. One of the things that was so valuable for me, and is still so valuable for me, is getting together with people to read. Reading groups with PhD students and colleagues, even if two of us are reading the same book, so that we get together and talk about it, but ideally, four of us or whatever, and therefore we get together and exchange ideas, and that is something, it's about us finding our time for it, and it's precisely your wording, client. That sort of wording makes us think that all of our time is accountable, and that we don't put aside time to build academic communities. So I think that's another, and I've been guilty of that myself recently. I think that we need to, keep reminding of ourselves to find those times.
That's an excellent. Thank you, Catherine. That's an excellent note to wrap up this session. I think it looks like what wouldn't change in the future is the element of collegiality that marks us apart from many other things. So, can you join me in thanking all of our panelists?